Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the shocking truths and untold stories hidden behind the palace walls. Tonight, a bombshell from the deepest chambers of royal history. A set of sealed letters marked with the insignia QER allegedly discovered inside the royal vault under Windsor. According to insiders, these letters were written by the late Queen Elizabeth II and labeled with a chilling directive: "For the Privy Council upon contingency." What contingency? That word alone has rattled Buckingham. Sources claim the contents outline strict limitations on the role and powers of a royal consort, guidelines that, if authenticated, could radically constrain Queen Camilla's reign. The discovery didn't come from a clerk or a lawyer. It came from Princess Anne, the monarchy's steel spine, during a routine archival review that suddenly became anything but routine. Aides say the palace phones lit up past midnight. A discreet summons was sent, files were rushed to a private room, names were whispered, and one phrase repeated like a drumbeat. The late Queen anticipated this. Was Elizabeth II warning the future? Did she leave a map to prevent the crown from bending to private influence again? One thing is clear: what Anne found in the vault has ignited a constitutional fuse. If these letters are authentic, if their instructions are binding, the balance of power inside the palace could shift overnight, and for the first time in years, the princes may have to stand together, not out of love, but out of duty, to the crown their mother protected. Stay with us. The vault has opened, and the past is speaking. The Royal Vault at Windsor is more than a burial place. It is also a repository of memory, sealed compartments holding centuries of private correspondence, directives, and artifacts too sensitive for public eyes. Few royals have unrestricted access. Princess Anne, by virtue of her tireless service and role as executor of several of her mother's private trusts, is one of the rare figures permitted to request direct entry. What she stumbled upon one autumn evening would rattle the monarchy to its very foundations. It began as a routine audit. Anne had developed a habit of reviewing archival rotations. The lists of documents moved from working libraries into long-term storage. She valued detail, and her eyes rarely missed irregularities. That night, as she walked past the stone alcoves under Windsor, she paused at a compartment sealed with deep red wax, marked with the insignia QER. The initials Quacumc Elizabeth Regina were Elizabeth II's personal sign-off, used only on the most sensitive communications. Curiosity became alarm when Anne noticed the parchment's label, "For the Privy Council upon contingency." The language was unmistakably deliberate. These were not idle reflections or private notes. They were instructions meant to be revealed only under certain conditions. Anne called for the keeper of the archives, demanding the register. The log confirmed the box had not been opened since Elizabeth's lifetime, its existence known only to a handful of clerks sworn to secrecy. Inside were several letters, neatly bound with ribbon and bearing the late Queen's seal. Anne read in silence, her eyes narrowing as each paragraph revealed its gravity. According to palace sources familiar with the contents, Elizabeth had laid out a clear framework for the role of a consort, their ceremonial standing, their limits in matters of state, and conditions under which their title could be reviewed. One passage was said to be particularly striking: "No consort may assume authority beyond the dignity bestowed, nor may the crown's trust be diluted by private ambition." Anne immediately recognized the implications. In an era where Camilla's role had already stirred controversy, these directives were dynamite. If made public or even acknowledged within council, they could restrict Camilla's power, potentially forcing her into a purely symbolic role, or, in the most extreme reading, opening the path to stripping her of the title altogether. Still, Anne was no impulsive agitator. She carefully documented the seals, requested copies under archival protocol, and ordered the compartment resealed with fresh wax. Witnesses later said her hands trembled slightly, a rare sign of emotion from the famously unflappable princess. She knew exactly what she had found, one insider said. It was as though Elizabeth had reached out from beyond the grave to remind them who the crown really belongs to. Before leaving the vault, Anne wrote a brief entry in her private log, one that aides say contained only a single phrase. "The Queen foresaw this." That sentence alone was enough to ignite speculation among those who caught sight of it. Back in her private apartments, Anne read the letters again, absorbing their weight. For decades, she had been the silent sentinel of the family, but these papers demanded action. They were not just relics, they were a blueprint, and if followed, they could redraw the balance of the monarchy overnight. The Princess Royal folded the documents, sealed them once more, and prepared herself for the battle ahead. Somewhere, deep inside Windsor, the vault had spoken, and Anne knew she was the only one strong enough to carry its message into the light. For Princess Anne, the discovery in the royal vault was not the end, it was the beginning. She had spent her life guarding the monarchy against scandal, but she also understood the dangers of moving too quickly. If she presented these letters without proof of authenticity, she would be accused of mischief or exaggeration. Camilla's allies could dismiss her claims as fabrication, and the crown itself could be weakened by the appearance of disunity. Anne would not allow that. Her first step was to summon the keeper of the archives under strict confidentiality. Together, they examined the seals again, comparing the wax impression to the late Queen's personal signet. Under magnification, the imprint revealed minute scratches that matched Elizabeth II's ring, a unique identifier catalogued decades earlier. The ribbon binding the letters was tested for age, its fibers analyzed to confirm it dated back to the early 2000s, precisely the period when Camilla's future role was under debate. Every test confirmed what Anne already believed. These letters were genuine. But Anne did not stop there. She requested the old council registers, cross-referencing the late Queen's handwriting with memoranda from the same year. The loops of the E, the sharp downstroke of the Q, the careful spacing all matched. For Anne, who had grown up watching her mother sign documents day after day, the recognition was immediate. "This is her hand," she whispered. According to one aide, no forgery could ever capture it. The second revelation came from the margin notes. One letter bore a discreet annotation, "For Lord Chamberlain only." That name was a key, a signal that Elizabeth had intended these instructions to be preserved within the highest office of ceremonial oversight. Anne scoured the Lord Chamberlain's private index, and sure enough, she found a corresponding reference, Directive on Consort Limitations, sealed in vault. The chain of custody was complete. Now came the question of law. Were these letters advisory, or were they binding? Anne consulted a retired constitutional scholar, a trusted family friend, who had advised the Queen during the Silver Jubilee. Without revealing specifics, she described the nature of the directives. His response was chilling. If they are authentic, they may hold constitutional weight. At minimum, they would be treated as guidance for the Privy Council. At maximum, they could be considered the Queen's final word on succession protocol. Anne knew what that meant. The letters were not just relics. They were potentially actionable. If exposed, they could force the monarchy to review Camilla's role, perhaps even strip her of certain powers. It would plunge the family into a constitutional crisis, but it would also vindicate Anne's instincts that Elizabeth had anticipated the dangers of a consort overstepping. Her nights grew restless. She read and reread the letters, each time feeling the echo of her mother's voice in the phrasing. She remembered Elizabeth's careful warnings, the way she had spoken of duty above all else. It was as though the Queen had left her a torch, hidden in the vault, until the day came when the darkness grew too deep. Still, Anne resisted the urge to act immediately. She documented every step of her verification, photographs of the seals, handwriting comparisons, witness logs. She built an unassailable case, knowing that when the storm came, she would need every scrap of evidence to withstand it. By the end of her investigation, Anne had no doubt. The letters were authentic, their message was unmistakable, and their implications could shake Buckingham Palace like an earthquake. She closed her dossier, sat in silence, and thought of the next move. The decision weighed heavily, but her resolve was clear. The truth could not remain locked in stone forever. The vault had spoken, and Anne would make sure its voice was heard. In the quiet of her private study, Princess Anne laid the sealed letters across the table once more. She had verified their authenticity beyond question, but one passage continued to trouble her. It was a phrase buried deep within a longer directive, written in Elizabeth's unmistakable hand. To protect the heirs from reputational wound, the consort must never overreach beyond the dignity bestowed. The wording struck Anne like a bell. Reputational wound to the heirs. Those words could only mean one thing: Diana. The scars of her life and her tragic death still shaped the monarchy decades later, and the heirs William and Harry had borne the brunt of it. Elizabeth, in her quiet, measured way, had encoded a warning into the very framework of her letters. Never again should a consort destabilize the standing of Diana's sons. Anne understood that the key to interpreting these letters did not lie only in the archive. It lay with the heirs themselves, particularly Harry. Though estranged and half a world away, Harry carried with him the memory of his mother's suffering and the bitter distrust of Camilla that he had voiced in every interview and memoir. If anyone could authenticate the emotional intent behind Elizabeth's words, it was him. Reaching out to Harry was no simple matter. To involve him meant igniting the press, reigniting old wounds, and risking accusations that she was weaponizing the Sussexes against Camilla. Yet Anne felt she had no choice. The letters spoke not just of constitutional limits, but of personal protection for the heirs. To exclude Harry would be to betray their very meaning. She penned a letter herself, this one not sealed with wax but written in her own firm script. The Queen foresaw the danger. Her words are in the vault. You may be the only one who remembers what they mean. It was brief, cryptic, but unmistakably serious. She arranged for it to be delivered discreetly through a trusted envoy, bypassing the usual channels that Camilla's allies could monitor. In California, when the letter arrived, Harry reportedly froze. He had grown accustomed to sensational headlines and royal summonses designed to shame him, but this was different. This was from Anne, the sister of his grandmother, the one royal he still respected for her blunt honesty and absence of theatrics. Meghan watched him read it twice, then a third time, before setting it down with a look of grim recognition. "It's about her," he whispered. "It's about my mother." Insiders say the mention of Diana's reputational wound stirred something raw in Harry. For years he had accused the institution of rewriting history, sanitizing the pain that had torn his family apart. Now, here was evidence that Elizabeth herself had acknowledged it, had tried to protect her grandsons from it. That revelation was enough to make him reconsider his distance. Still, Harry was cautious. He reached out quietly through encrypted channels, confirming to Anne that he had received her message. He asked a single question: do the letters speak of limits or of removal? Anne's reply was stark: both are possible. That was enough. Harry knew he had to return. Not for reconciliation, not for politics, but for the chance to honor the one person who had always understood his grandmother. For Anne, the response was confirmation. The thread had been pulled, and Harry was back in play. The vault's message was no longer confined to parchment. It had leapt across the ocean, into the heart of the son who had once vowed never to return. The stage was set. The heirs were being drawn into the fight, just as Elizabeth had predicted. And now, with Harry stepping into the circle, the pressure on Camilla was about to intensify beyond anything she had ever faced. Windsor Castle has hosted countless banquets, coronations, and councils, but on this night, its halls carried a different weight. There were no state trumpets, no ceremonial uniforms, no flashing cameras. Instead, the stone corridors echoed with quiet footsteps and the soft rustle of confidential papers being carried underarm. The meeting that was about to unfold was not a celebration of the monarchy, it was a trial of its very soul. Princess Anne arrived first, as she often did. Her file of documents was tucked under one arm, the red wax seals of Elizabeth II carefully preserved. She did not intend to perform. She intended to present facts. Within minutes, William entered, every step measured, his face pale but composed. He gave Anne a brief nod, his eyes betraying the tension of a man caught between father and duty. Then came Harry. His arrival was not announced in the press, yet whispers had already spread. The estranged son, the outsider, had returned for a single night under the vaulted ceilings of Windsor. His presence filled the room with an almost unbearable electricity. For years, William and Harry had stood apart, one anchored to the crown, the other flung to the edges of exile. Now they were here, together, summoned by their aunt and united by their grandmother's words. The final arrival was Camilla. She swept into the chamber with her usual air of composed dignity, but those who watched closely noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the subtle tightness of her jaw. She carried her own folder of documents, explanations, perhaps excuses. If Anne's dossier was a blade, Camilla's was a shield. King Charles was notably absent. His aides claimed fatigue, but those inside the family whispered another truth. He could not bring himself to watch the confrontation. His absence left the others to fight in the shadow of his reign. Anne began without preamble. She laid the sealed letters on the mahogany table, the wax glinting under the soft lamplight. Her voice was steady, each word clipped with military precision. "These are the Queen's directives," she said. Her handwriting, her seals, her intent, they speak to the role of a consort and the boundaries that must never be crossed. She read aloud key passages, her tone growing sharper with each line. The words were unambiguous. The crown belonged to the sovereign, not the consort. Ambition beyond duty was forbidden, and under contingency, titles could be reviewed. Camilla was quick to respond. These letters were written at a time of uncertainty, she countered, her voice smooth but firm. They were reflections, not decrees. The Queen herself welcomed me into this family, recognized me as consort. Would she write such things and still bless my role? Her rhetorical question hung in the air, but Anne did not flinch. William spoke next, his tone calm yet heavy with unspoken frustration. Then why hide them? He asked. Why were they sealed away, marked for the Privy Council? If they were merely reflections, why preserve them with such secrecy? Harry leaned forward, his voice sharper. Because she knew, he said, his eyes locked on Camilla. She knew what could happen if ambition was left unchecked. She knew what it had already done to my mother. Camilla's composure faltered. You abandoned this family, she snapped at Harry. You have no place judging what role I hold. But Anne cut her off with a raised hand. This is not about abandonment. This is about principle. The late Queen did not leave us opinions, she left us instructions. And those instructions are clear. The room fell into a tense silence. Outside, Windsor remained quiet, the tourists long gone, the night deepening. But within those stone walls, the monarchy's future hung suspended. The sealed letters had been revealed, the heirs had spoken, and Camilla stood isolated at the end of the table, her defenses weakening. No official minutes would ever record this meeting, yet those who were present knew that history had just shifted. The vault had opened, and the ghosts of the past were now seated among them. What began as a quiet revelation in the depths of the royal vault erupted into a constitutional storm by the following day. Princess Anne's dossier, complete with photographs of seals and sworn witness statements from the archivists, reached the Lord Chamberlain before dawn. He, in turn, convened a confidential meeting of senior members of the Privy Council. Officially, it was described as routine housekeeping, but those summoned knew at enquire. Inside the council chamber, beneath oil portraits of monarchs who had weathered crises of their own, the atmosphere was taut with unease. Spread across the polished oak table were high-resolution images of Elizabeth II's letters, their ink faded but unmistakably in her hand. The councillors studied them as though peering into the mind of the late Queen, their silence broken only by the scratching of pens on notepads. The key SDR. Legal minds debated whether such directives were advisory or binding. One King's Council argued that Elizabeth's words must be treated as guidance, a personal instruction rather than a constitutional mandate. Another countered that the presence of the royal seal and the phrase "for the Privy Council" elevated them into something closer to law. The archivist, pale but unwavering, confirmed the chain of custody. The letters had been locked away by Elizabeth's order, logged in the council's R. As the debate deepened, a sense of inevitability settled over the councillors. Whether binding or not, the late Queen's words could not be ignored. Even as this framework took shape, whispers spread through the palace about how to manage the immediate fallout. Senior courtiers quietly devised a transition plan that would shift responsibilities without appearing punitive. Engagements might be redistributed, Camilla's patronages subjected to closer oversight, and Princess Anne's ceremonial role quietly expanded to ensure that publicly, when Charles was finally briefed, he listened in silence, his fingers pressed together in that familiar gesture of restraint. He did not dispute the authenticity of the letters, he could not. Instead, he asked only whether the measures would preserve dignity. If it steadies the crown, then proceed, he said softly, but there must be no cruelty. His words were relayed to Anne, who accepted them with characteristic brevity. She cared little for Camilla's feelings. What mattered was that the monarchy survive without stain. By nightfall, the story had already begun to leak. A single sentence, whispered to a journalist, grew into a headline that raced across the news cycle. Privy Council reviews limits of the Queen Consort. Anne, watching the storm unfold, stood at her window in Windsor as rain streaked the glass. She thought of her mother, who had spent 70 years reminding her family that the crown was not theirs to wield, but theirs to serve. The vault had given them Elizabeth's voice once more, and Anne intended to ensure that it was not drowned out by ambition. The morning after the Privy Council's secret session, London awoke to a whisper that had already grown into a roar. What began as a vague line in a political column, questions over the scope of the Queen Consort's role, spread across broadsheets, tabloids, and international outlets in a matter of hours. By midday, news anchors were speaking openly of Elizabeth II's hidden letters, and speculation raged that Camilla's position had been placed under unprecedented review. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, their faces pressed against the gates, demanding clarity. Some held placards bearing Diana's image. Others called for Anne to be honored as the protector of Elizabeth's legacy. The mood was volatile. Admiration for the Princess Royal's honesty mingled with anger at the thought that the monarchy's trust had been compromised again. "We loved the late Queen because she never hid from duty," one woman told reporters. "If she left instructions, they must be followed, even if it means Camilla steps aside." Across social media, the storm intensified. Hashtags like #Vault Letters and #Trust the Queen trended worldwide. Video clips of William and Harry's rare joint appearance at Windsor, grainy images leaked by someone inside the castle, went viral within minutes. Commentators seized on the symbolism. Two estranged brothers, momentarily united, defending their grandmother's legacy against the stepmother they had never truly embraced. It was an image too powerful for the public to ignore. Opinion polls, rushed out by broadcasters eager to capture the mood, showed a dramatic plunge in Camilla's approval ratings. In contrast, Anne's popularity soared, with newspapers hailing her as the Steel Princess who had once again put country before comfort. William was praised for his calm restraint, Harry for his fiery honesty, and Charles for his silence, though that silence was quickly recast as weakness by critics who wondered why the king had left others to fight in his stead. Beyond Britain, the reaction rippled through the Commonwealth. In Australia, calls for republicanism gained fresh momentum, framed not as hostility to the monarchy itself, but as exasperation with its endless scandals. In Canada, editorialists praised Anne's courage, suggesting that her forthrightness reflected the very qualities that had sustained the monarchy in Elizabeth's time. American networks fixated on Harry, painting him as the reluctant son dragged back into the storm, a prince torn between exile and duty. Inside Westminster, MPs debated the matter in hushed tones. Some feared that undermining Camilla would destabilize the crown, just as Charles's reign was finding its rhythm. Others argued that transparency was the only path forward, that ignoring Elizabeth's letters would look like a cover-up and invite even deeper scrutiny. A few even whispered that perhaps Anne herself should be given a more formal constitutional role, her reputation as incorruptible making her the monarchy's most reliable safeguard. For the public, though, the narrative had already hardened. Camilla was cast as the villain once more, accused of ambition and secrecy, while Anne stood as the truth-teller, William the steady heir, and Harry the prodigal son, reluctantly returning to defend his mother's honor. It was a tableau too neat, too dramatic, to be entirely accurate, but in the battle for perception, accuracy mattered less than symbolism. By nightfall, candlelit vigils appeared outside Kensington Palace and Windsor. People gathered to sing hymns, to hold up photographs of Elizabeth and Diana, to demand that the crown heed the wisdom of the past. Television panels buzzed with speculation about whether the Queen Consort could survive such a storm. Even loyal monarchists admitted, off the record, that the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Inside the palace walls, courtiers worked late into the night, drafting statements and rehearsing lines of defense. But no matter how carefully they chose their words, the reality was unavoidable. The public had turned, the vault had spoken, and Camilla's reign as consort now hung by the thinnest of threads. As midnight settled over Buckingham Palace, the gilded halls stood hushed. But inside the private chambers, the weight of history pressed like a storm, waiting to break. The letters from the vault, once silent for decades, had unleashed a chain of events that could not be reversed. What had begun as Anne's solitary discovery had grown into a constitutional debate, a public reckoning, and a trial of trust that placed the monarchy itself under the harshest light. Princess Anne sat alone in her apartments, the copied pages spread before her once again. She traced the familiar strokes of her mother's handwriting, hearing Elizabeth's voice in every phrase. For Anne, this was not about vengeance against Camilla, nor even about personal loyalty to her nephews. It was about duty, the sacred duty to ensure that the institution survived unsullied. Yet she also knew that by opening the vault, she had lit a fire that could consume her family. At Clarence House, King Charles wrestled with the consequences. He had built a life with Camilla against extraordinary odds, weathered decades of criticism to finally see her crowned beside him. Now, in the twilight of his reign, he was confronted with his mother's ghost in ink and wax. To uphold the directives was to acknowledge that his wife's authority must be curtailed. To ignore them was to risk betraying Elizabeth's legacy and undermining the fragile trust of the people. His advisors urged caution, but the silence in his heart was deafening. "How much of the past can one man fight?" he reportedly asked, staring at the letters until dawn. William, meanwhile, found himself at the threshold of kingship in all but name. The weight of expectation, the call for transparency, the symbolic unity with Harry, it all pointed to a future that was coming faster than he had ever imagined. In public, he remained calm, but in private he confided that the monarchy could not survive on half-truths. If his father wavered, he would be forced to act. The role of heir was no longer a waiting game. It was a burden he carried every waking hour. Harry returned briefly to his wife and children, but the fire in his eyes had not dimmed. He had come when Anne called, and he had spoken when silence would have been easier. For once, he had not been cast as the runaway or the rebel. He had been his mother's son, defending the line Elizabeth had drawn. Whether he stayed engaged or withdrew again to California, the fact remained: his voice had mattered. The crown, however, reluctantly, had been forced to listen. And Camilla? She carried on with her schedule, attending an engagement the next morning with a practiced smile and a steady wave. But those who looked closely saw the shadows beneath her eyes, the strain in her movements. She knew the tide had turned. The whispers in Parliament, the vigils in the streets, the icy distance of Anne, William, and Harry, they had built a fortress of doubt around her. For the first time since her marriage to Charles, the title she had fought for seemed less like a crown and more like a fragile ornament, ready to be snatched away at any moment. No final proclamation was issued that night. The Privy Council had yet to make its formal determination, the king had yet to announce his course, and the palace press office spoke only of continuity and clarity. But in the silence that followed, everyone understood the truth. The monarchy stood on a knife's edge, its future swaying between memory and modernity, between loyalty to the past and survival in the present. Outside, rain slicked the pavements of London, and the crowds slowly dispersed. Yet the mood lingered, a sense that history had shifted, that the crown was no longer untouchable, and that the late Queen's voice still echoed through the corridors of power. The letters had not delivered a verdict, only a warning, and it was that warning which now hung over the realm like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. Whether Camilla endured, whether Charles steadied the throne, whether William and Harry's fragile unity could hold, none of it was certain. What was certain was that the vault had spoken, and once its secrets were revealed, nothing in the monarchy would ever be the same again.